We're live.
Good evening, listeners. Welcome to another edition of Socialist Action Webcasts. My name is Elizabeth Weiss, and I am the Federal Treasurer of Socialist Action, a member of the NDP Socialist Caucus Steering Committee. We acknowledge that this event is taking place on Indigenous lands across Turtle Island, known as North America. That includes the unceded territories of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Wendat and Haudenosaunee people, in a place called Toronto. Today, I am speaking to you from Jamaica, where the indigenous Taino and Arawak-speaking people began arriving here 4,000 years ago, but were wiped out by European colonial powers. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no real reconciliation without restitution. That entails seizing the assets of the big resource corporations and returning them to the commons. Tonight's topic is the struggle for Indigenous liberation from colonialism and capitalism with Eric Johnston of the Native Canadian Centre of Toronto and Barry Weisleder, Federal Secretary, Socialist Action. Eric will speak for about 25 minutes and Barry will speak for 15. Then we will take questions from the online audience. Audience members can submit a question by accessing the webcast directly from YouTube and by typing the question into the chat column. You may direct your question to a specific person or to both panelists. If you agree with what you hear during this program, please join Socialist Action by signing up at our website, www.socialistaction.ca, and by calling 647-986-1917. Easy to remember, 1917 was the year of the Russian Revolution. And if you like the show, folks, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. So let's begin. Let's welcome our first speaker. Eric Johnston is the Cultural Program Manager at the Native Canadian Centre of Toronto. He has worked on numerous areas of research in Indian control of Indian education, land claims, addiction, program research with Health Canada's Medical Services Native Addiction Health Program, as well as serving 13 years working in a variety of capacities within the 90-bed alcohol and drug treatment facility in San Francisco. Welcome, Eric.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for the kind introduction and the time to be able to talk on from an Indigenous perspective in this world of politics. As the introduction was mentioning that my formal education though is one with a history degree, and what I concentrated on was looking at the point of contact with the colonizing powers. So with that area of concentration, I also pursued another diploma and got a legal office administration, which kind of prepared me to do political history, I guess. And so it was that those two disciplines or those two areas that I was schooled in was able to work a lot within political perspectives and also do research. I guess in trying to talk about the Indigenous point of view from a natural resources, before we get into really talking about the kinds of remedies that could promote reconciliation, there's a lot of natural resource and environmental resource history that a lot of people are probably not aware of. It's not taught within mainstream society. But some of the history that seems to be within people's reach is that most people understand that Indian people within the Canadian experience and with the United States experience was they were placed on reserves. So they were really not in a position to exploit land. They, the many of the agencies that came into existence because of the amount of damage that was being done to natural environments, the levels of pollution. The It just ends up that many of these agencies uh, came into direct conflict with Indigenous people and the kinds of activities that, as a people, that they were used to. That this is what they did. This is what they knew. So rather than target the industries that were doing most of the damage, they end up targeting Indigenous people. And that ends up being pretty much the relationship that formed between, in the United States, the US government, and Canada, the Canadian Crown. So most of the effort was to get Indigenous people from not carrying out their activities and to keep them on the reserve. It wasn't too long once when you start to hear, even from the whether it's a federal resource manager, an environmental manager, or a provincial one, that they'll tell you that the industry drives those ministries. The idea that economy is only possible through the destruction of natural environments is a truth, but that doesn't have a really easy solution to it. And it probably doesn't really matter all that much in terms of whether it's a liberal or a conservative or even an NDP government. The amount of power that's represented by corporate interest is, and the thing about it is that much of the areas of economy are dependent on this corporate wealth and this the idea of the longevity of that this wealth can bring to economic plans, whether they're conservative, liberal, or NDP. And some of what gets lost in this perspective I'm working with is just how past governments have eroded environmental protections. And I'm not talking like 40 or 50 years ago. I'm talking within the last 10, 15 years. People have been pretty much kept unaware in terms of how private interests have been protected through changes within the Freedoms of Information Act. The Mike Harris government was responsible for making major changes in terms of environmental protection so that they could look appealing to industries. Some of the economic platforms of the Harris government was to deforest, which again put them in direct conflict with Indigenous people. So you started to see a shrinking of federal and provincial responsibilities, and as those responsibilities were shrinking, they were being handed off to the very same corporate interests. The management responsibilities were starting to be handed off to the corporate interest. And they would not only be the people who would be impacting and exploiting natural resources, they were being positioned to become the manager and the monitors of their own activities. And a lot of people don't really realize that that's what was being done. So that's the other changes that even make this even more difficult to understand is how changes of the Freedom of Information Act came into play to say, well, you know, even though an industry was causing a certain amount of harm, because they were then starting to be moved into the area of being the manager, that they got the discretion to be able to say, well, how much do we tell the public about what it is that we're doing and what kinds of impacts we're having on things. And more than that, you start to, at a federal level, like this is just with a conservative Harris government, that you end up at a federal level is that you end up with the NAFTA agreement. And within that, you start to see more powerful U.S. interests start to find its way into Canadian economies. And those agreements are, you end up really having to look at your water. There's some really, I won't go any further into that to say that it's there should be considerable worry about those kinds of arrangements that are involving Canadian natural resources. And because of the public's own environmental footing in terms of them being able to protect their own environments, all of that has been eroded slowly over the last 25 years. And so it's beyond a lot of people's memories, that they're not even aware that their ability to defend themselves on their environment and their own drinking water has slowly been taken away from them. And changes to the Freedom of Information Act even makes that a difficult find to find that out, even if you do want to know. So what I guess some of what my talk is tonight is to say that the Indigenous personality is one of the few personalities that are left intact. Undefined, certainly, because it is a very steep uphill battle for Indigenous people to assert rights and to have rights recognized, which is one of the disadvantages that corporate interests didn't have to go through. They did not have to prove that they owned anything. They were just given those management responsibilities, even if they didn't have one deed in their back pocket to do any of what they were doing, but they were given access to these resources. You got on this opposite side, you have Indigenous people having to fight through all these management schemes that, and some of them are probably not even really management schemes. Some of them are just studies. You can have one study about this, one study about that, but it's not really a management scheme. You know, the whole idea of how you're going to protect and manage resources with a 50-year type of scope in mind is probably not in place, not on the provincial level or the federal level. So you start to, when people start to look around to say, well, what can we do? Well, my suggestions are that it's probably time to, fundamentally, when Indigenous people would start to, given the opportunity, given the capacity to develop management plans, those management plans would probably start to contain things like sweetgrass beds, freshwater sources, burial grounds. There'd be certain places that were considered sacred because of spiritual beliefs or spiritual commitments that were made to those particular areas. And when you start to see a management plan that starts to emerge with these types of importances involved or woven into those management plans, you'll start to see two things. One is that those management plans really do not have anything to do with the economy, because the values that are driving the development of those management schemes do not have those values in them. They have a different set of types of values, and that's what's. And the other thing that you start to see is that, given that, the natural resources are probably being afforded much more protection, and the longevity of that protection is not up for. It's not up for. It's not composed of something that can change 5 or 10 years around, depending on who's in power and what type of corporations they're hanging around with. The elected party, what corporate buddies they have. And so I guess some of what I'm saying tonight too is that whatever party that is talking this politics about the future of people, that at a fundamental level, the idea of what the natural world is has to be there. And even in indigenous people too, in some corners of the land are caught in this dilemma of, do we advance our rights? Do we implement our rights with the idea that we have to adapt them to current economic schemes? Do we gain these rights over territories just so that we can be the ones who are cutting down the trees, or we are the ones posing up to corporate interests? Is that the goal? And for myself, I'm saying that those are probably the more important conversations to start to get into. And those are probably some of the more important conversations that should be starting to be posed to how governments are going to give people an alternative way to create a lifestyle that just does not lean into or lead us into a lifestyle that has no limits. The whole idea of consumption and the how we heat our homes, how we grow our food, how we those are really some of the thinking, I guess, that I would see that would benefit, or at least provide alternatives. Is a lot of that has to go back to the local level, and local people have to be given an opportunity to find alternative ways to heat themselves, alternative ways to ensure cleaner water for themselves. Not that you're going to go against the economy, to say, there is a way to have economy. It just does not mean that we have to go where huge systems are like the pipeline system, like fossil fuels is probably the one that's most front and center right now. Is that is so much value being given to these type of large systems that are just so destructive that you can't undo the destruction. Once all that fossil fuel is out of the ground, that you can't put it into the ground. You can't pull out the carbon and all the other things here. That's pretty much there to stay. Same thing with nuclear power. It's definitely, once you get it out of the ground, and once it's above ground, And once people are dependent on it, and then after, you know, the cells run out in the nuclear plant, and you're still left with the problem that you've got all the nuclear waste above ground, and it still has the potential to destroy environments that people really do depend on. So I'm trying to provide both a historical analysis. What I'm also wanting to provide is an analysis that's able to explain the now. But I also want to be able to start to provide an analysis that shows there is a way forward. And part of what I see as that way forward is in this short talk, and again, like 25 minutes, and then I know I'm not a good amount of time I have to ramble on here, but 25 minutes is not a very long period of time, considering for how long the processes and the societal development that we find ourselves in. 25 minutes is just a blink of the eye. You know, to give this really serious thought. A couple of key points that I wanted to make sure that I made tonight, especially within Ontario, is that throughout all my years that I've been involved in politics, that the provincial government of Ontario is situated where there are wampum belts. It's also situated where there are pre-Confederation treaties. And what I'm saying is that these are agreements that were here specifically dealing with land arrangements before there was an Ontario. And I've sat in enough meetings as a technician, and the constant question was, show us where your authority comes from. And they will refer you to, there's some court orders that provided this. We're kind of looking at, and we would ask that, and we'd ask that, and years would go by, and we'd still be asking this question: where's your authority? And it came down to a meeting that I pulled together in Ottawa when I was working for the Assembly of First Nations, and there was lawyers there, and one was a well-respected constitutional lawyer. The other one was a well-respected litigation lawyer, and she was echoing pretty much what the provincial position was. We have this delegated authority, and the constitutional lawyer said, well, a court order is not enough. In order for a crown, the provincial crown, to go into an Indigenous community in Ontario, they would have to write where they got that authority on every single letter that they wrote. It would have to be right on top where we get this delegated authority from. This is the authority that we use when why we're here, what gives us the authority to be here, what we're saying. And he says, and because if they can't do that, that means that they don't have that authority. And he says, because if they did have that authority, you can bet that reference would be on top of every single letter that they were writing. And he says, for them not to be able to do that, this tells me that they do not have that authority. For the last 100 or so years, many chiefs in Ontario have been somewhat getting confused by governments coming forward and saying these kinds of things, where they do not, they're saying they have the authority, but they can't produce it. So what this means is, when we do something, if we go hunting or we do something else, we exercise a land right, or we exercise a protection over water, the federal or provincial government are going to come to us and they're going to ask, by what authority do you do this? And I don't know about anybody else, but I'd be standing there right beside the Mohawk brothers saying, buy these wampum belts. I'd be standing beside the representatives of the pre-Confederation treaty saying, by these treaties, these pre-Confederation, this gives us the authority, to do this. And then that throws the federal or provincial crowns into the position of saying, well, we got more authority where we have, they don't have an arrangement. They don't have an answer for that one yet. A second consideration I'd have listeners consider tonight would be, there was a Supreme Court ruling called the Sparrow Decision on conservation. Conservation was centerpiece to that decision. And it said that there was a ranking system in terms of users that would, when it came to natural resource usage. Although the ranking system was established and Indigenous people were put first, the one thing that got left undefined was what conservation is. And I think that is of interest to everybody at this time. Is conservation to mean the natural biodiversity that operating within all ecosystems that are around us right now? Is that what conservation is? Or is conservation the corporate interpretation of what kind of utility is, what is the utility value? And if you challenge the corporate interest and you get a look at some of the environmental protection triggers that are within not law, not within the Constitution, but within policies that have been shaped by provincial and federal governments to cater to corporate interest. And, no net gain, no net loss got changed to net gain. Those are corporate ideas guiding environmental protection policy. And yet people don't have enough history to really understand the impacts of this policy and what it allows. Anyways, I think I've just about run out of time. I got lost in my own story here.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Eric. You will have more time later on in the question period or wrap up. Okay, thank you very much. Our next speaker is Barry Weisleder. Barry is a retired teacher, a union organizer, co-chair of the NDP Socialist Caucus, and a member of the editorial board of Socialist Action newspaper and Turn Left magazine. He is the federal secretary of Socialist Action, League for Action Socialists, and he's the political producer of SA Webcasts. Welcome, Barry.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good evening, comrades and friends, sisters and brothers. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with Eric. I really enjoyed his presentation. I'm a history teacher, though not an academic. At the time of first contact, there were an estimated 2 million Indigenous people in Canada, in what is now known as Canada, and as many as 75 million people, Indigenous people in the Western Hemisphere. White settlers brought with them diseases such as smallpox, bubonic plague, malaria, and others for which Indigenous people had no immunity. No one knows how many died. Perhaps 60% of the Indigenous population, perhaps more. Enervated by such devastation and facing an enemy with superior technology, the long and desperate struggle against settler invasion and conquest resulted in the Indigenous peoples in what is today Canada and the entire hemisphere being pushed back, relocated, purposely starved by destruction of crops and game, and forced at gunpoint to sign treaties ceding the bulk of their territory to the racist settler enemy. At the heart of the conflict was the clash between two incompatible modes of production. Most Indigenous societies were characterized by common ownership of the tools and resources. The European invaders, on the other hand, brought with them private ownership, slavery, and a violent state power. Law flows from power, not power from law. The Indigenous struggle here echoed the struggles of Indigenous people around the world faced with European mercantile capital and then imperialist conquest. The Indigenous peoples of the Americas have a long history of resistance to these colonial policies, beginning with resistance to Columbus. In response to this resistance came brutal settler repression in the form of imprisonment of activists, selected assassination of Mapuche activists in Argentina and Chile, the hanging of Louis Riel, and the mass murders of 300,000 Indigenous people in the highland communities of Guatemala. But the resistance continues. From the armed stand taken at Oka in Quebec and Wounded Knee in South Dakota, to the creation of Indigenous armies like the Zapatistas in Mexico and in the Cusco area of Peru, to the water keepers fighting pipelines and the forest protectors of the Amazon in Brazil, Bolivia, and Ecuador. The international nature of Indigenous struggles is reflected in the extensive development of contacts among Indigenous groups themselves, quickly learning and sharing tactics among Indigenous groups, and the development and adoption of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Demands for self-determination, self-government, and control over their lands and resources are democratic demands for sovereignty and national rights. Nevertheless, they have revolutionary implications because of the implacable hostility of imperialism to acceptance of Indigenous control over what is often valuable land and resources, and the penchant for Indigenous people to develop these lands and resources by means of consensus and with a healthy regard for the people and animals living there. The deep connection between Indigenous peoples and the lands they live on make them natural leaders in the struggle against environmental destruction and human annihilation at the hands of the capitalist class, which places profit literally before the survival of our species and others. The Indigenous peoples of Canada are thrust into a role of keepers of the land, the water, and the creatures of nature by virtue of their integration with nature and their non-destructive outlook towards their use of nature's resources in order to live. We all have to move towards the Indigenous way of understanding our planet in order to survive. Since first contact, the history of European settler-invader relations with Indigenous people in what is today Canada has been one of colonization, brutality, exploitation, murder, rape, forcible removal of children to, quote, residential schools, quote, where they have been maltreated, sexually assaulted, undernourished, and overworked and punished for speaking their native languages. The lands were stolen and transferred to colonists and the colonial state for little or no compensation, and the resources thereon used to enrich the settler capitalist class without royalties or other compensation to Indigenous people. Treaties negotiated between the settler capitalist state and Indigenous peoples were craftily drafted, written in English, and often the written treaties did not include promises that were made verbally. Further, the treaties were interpreted narrowly by the capitalist government and the courts, or simply abrogated to the benefit of the state and capitalist corporations. In other words, title over vast tracts of native land was never ceded by the Indigenous people, but such unceded land was used by the settlers, their governments, and corporations nonetheless. Indigenous peoples did not believe they were giving up mineral and mining rights over their resources under the surface of the land when they accepted reservations, but large mining corporations have been allowed to steal these resources with little or no compensation. The Indigenous peoples, nevertheless, have struggled consistently to protect and preserve their own lands, rights, resources, languages, cultures, philosophies, and the way of life against all odds. For revolutionary socialists, The struggle of oppressed peoples for independence and freedom from the capitalist oppressors and exploiters makes them allies in the struggle by the working class to overthrow and replace capitalism with public ownership and workers' power. This includes Indigenous people in the Canadian state. We are all fighting the same enemy. Further, no gain by the Indigenous people will ever be secure so long as capitalism remains in control. The rights of Indigenous people will always be under threat from the drive for profit by Canadian capitalists and their state henchmen. Only in a post-capitalist society can the Indigenous in Canada hope finally and securely to win their goals. Indigenous peoples in Canada have based their struggle on the preservation and restoration of their treaty lands and on the application of the treaties between them and the settler state. In fact, it has been the existence of treaty lands, so-called reserves, that allow the Indigenous people to survive the settler capitalist unceasing efforts to abolish their separate existence as Indigenous people. Their struggle to preserve their lands, languages, cultures, and control over their resources is a form of national liberation struggle by an oppressed people against the capitalist class and their state for survival and dignity as a people. Their diversity of languages and cultures does not detract from this characterization. Indigenous leaders have developed strong affinity for their common struggles, including Canadian statewide organizations, representations, and actions. This does not always mean that Indigenous people will be united on every issue. How could it be? For example, starve for funds for health and education, housing and infrastructure, not to mention job-creating projects and fair wages. Some Indigenous bands have signed deals with Kinder Morgan regarding the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. In fact, in the Toronto Star on March the 6th, there was a debate between two Indigenous people, Stephen Buffalo versus Melissa Mullen Dupuis, over cancellation of the Keystone XL pipeline. Stephen was unhappy about that, and Melissa had the opposite reaction. So, this is a two-step dance. The federal government starves Indigenous people for funds, then Kinder Morgan comes along and waves a few $1 million. Of course, some Indigenous accepted it. It says more about the continued settler colonialism and the bands who signed such deals. When Jean Chrétien was Minister of Indian Affairs under the government of Pierre Trudeau, he had an aptly named white paper produced in 1969 that proposed to turn the common lands of the reserves into private property that could be bought and sold by individuals, to end all treaty obligations unilaterally, and to integrate, forcibly assimilate, that is, all Indigenous peoples into white society. Indigenous resistance staved off that threat for the time being. Harold Cardinal, a member of the Cree Nation, in a book called The Unjust Society, made the case against Chrétien's barefaced racist policy. Indigenous people are part of the international working class. In Mexico, Central America, and South America, they are an overwhelming proportion of the workers' movement. The people of these areas proudly self-identify as Indigenous, except for the Creole bourgeoisie, who identify as being of Spanish descent. In Canada and the United States, where racist attitudes form a systemic barrier to employment, Indigenous workers are primarily found within the construction sector, both union and non-union, in the West Coast fisheries and logging sectors, and in the East Coast fisheries and related industries, primarily employed by band-owned co-ops. In northern Saskatchewan and northern Alberta, the uranium and tar sands industries are the major Indigenous employers. As revolutionary socialists, Socialist Action fights for the right of all Indigenous people in Canada to preserve their treaty lands and to have their land claims quickly and fully adjudicated by panels, at least half of which should be Indigenous appointees, and to exercise the right of self-determination over these lands. Sovereignty includes the right to exercise their own legal sovereignty over all aspects of these lands, including all rights to natural resources, the right to determine what, if any, energy is transmitted through these lands, the right to exclude the authority of Canadian police, military, and legal authority, and to operate their own constabulary courts and legal system. Socialist Action demands that the currently badly flawed Commission on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls be replaced with a new commission should be established to investigate missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, composed primarily of Indigenous women with adequate funding and access to legal, investigative, and forensic expertise, and with full power to compel testimony from any person in Canada, including police and military and politicians, and to recommend changes be laid under the charges be laid under the criminal code against persons they find responsible for death and injury to Indigenous women and girls. We demand that Canada provide funds equal to those provided by the provinces to their settler citizens for education, health, housing, and all other services as partial compensation for the genocidal policies and expropriations of the past. Ample funds can readily be found by expropriation of the trillions of dollars amassed by the energy and mineral resource giant corporations. No reconciliation without restitution of Indigenous peoples. No reconciliation, no conciliation without restitution. We demand that the cases of the massive numbers of Indigenous peoples in Canadian prisons be turned over to Indigenous nations for review, and that their decisions on these prisoners by native legal authorities be immediately and fully implemented by Canadian authorities. We call on the NDP, the unions, and other allies of working people to support the struggles of Indigenous people in Canada for sovereignty, justice, and compensation, to mobilize and support where these struggles manifest themselves. We urge the NDP and unions to fight for Indigenous men and women to be hired, trained, and promoted on an equitable and non-racist basis, and for the provision of affordable housing, education, and welfare, including treatment for addiction arising from the systemic exclusion, marginalization, and racism of the settler society toward Indigenous women, men, and children. We urge the NDP, unions, and others to invite the participation and input of Indigenous people in all struggles for economic and social justice in Canada and for the establishment of a workers' government. What do I have? 2 or 3 minutes?
Go ahead. Good time.
Like women, Quebecois, Acadians, and LGBTQI folks, Indigenous people cannot win alone. We encourage Indigenous militants to join, to work with, and to join Socialist Action for our mutual benefit. The Revolutionary Vanguard needs the voices of Indigenous militants inside our organization to facilitate beneficial cooperation and coordination between Indigenous and working class struggles. Indigenous leaders need the benefit of the knowledge gained in our historic struggles against the very same enemy by the workers and our other allies. Now, that perspective that I just laid out is increasingly the view of Indigenous activists across Turtle Island who identify as Marxists and communists. One such organization is the Red Braid Alliance. And if I have time, I want to quote from its Basis of Unity. How much time do I have, Chair?
About 2 minutes.
Okay. The Red Braid Alliance is a revolutionary organization dedicated to building the sovereign power of Indigenous peoples and the autonomous power of the working class, all in our multiplicity. We are active on lands occupied by British Columbia. That's the Red Braid Alliance. We practice and advocate for strategic unity between Indigenous peoples fighting for sovereignty through dismantling colonialism, the national liberation struggles of peoples around the world against imperialism, and the working class for worlds without capitalism. We prepare to take power away from capitalists and colonizers by increasing the autonomous power of communities where we are as part of the insurgent working class and Indigenous peoples movements of the world. While our communities may rely on scarce resources offered by the state as a matter of survival, we fight to abolish police and prisons and for community control over social wage institutions. Through our struggles, we create autonomous supports and transformative justice that help us heal, care for ourselves, and build the power to collectively strike at the roots of our shared trauma, alienation, and despair. We fight for multiple worlds where production serves the needs of our communities and where the free, full creative development of each person is the responsibility of all. Colonialism, capitalism, and imperialism are destroying our communities and the non-human world. Colonialism attacks Indigenous economies, land relations, and ways of being in an ongoing genocidal war waged by occupying nation states and settler civil societies, including those closest to us in Canada and across the United States. Well, I'm going to skip to the end because they talk about decolonial feminism and many other things that are just superb. To survive together in a time when reform is impossible and to build revolutionary movements powerful enough to overthrow colonialism, capitalism, and imperialism, we need a revolutionary politics that provides relevant power to our everyday struggles, explains our suffering, and answers our dreams and desires. The power we build together will enable us to transcend the local conditions of individualized survival, seeding and sprouting the forms of our global revolutionary tomorrows. And there's another organization in the U.S. called the Red Nation. It adopted a manifesto in 2019. It was written by Lee Maracle, which some people here will recall. And basically, it says, communism is our horizon, kinship is our path, indigenous and black liberation are the spear for socialist revolution in Turtle Island. We seek to end the logics of carcerality, including private property that warehouse people, cage animals, and enclose lands within borders. This is a perspective that we in Socialist Action share, and that's why we seek to work with the Red Nation and the Braid Alliance, and to bring the politics of Indigenous liberation into the heart of the workers' movement, where we will forge the revolutionary leadership capable of getting rid of capitalism and its threats to nature and humanity once and for all. If you agree, we invite you to join us. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Barry. Okay, so now we're going to go to our technical producer, Kurt. And so we'll take the first two questions. Kurt, if you would like to put them in the chat column, please.
Okay, so the first question comes from myself, and I asked, how do we convince Canadians that the economy should not come at the expense of the environment? And Dinner with Franklin asked, Mr. Johnston spoke of learning limits. Is that concept consistent among most nations, and or is it becoming more common?
Okay, so we will go to Eric first, and then to Barry, and you have 5 minutes.
I guess I'll tackle the second question first. If I talk about, if I put forward the idea that it's time to where settler people or immigrated people or non-native people, the time has come where the consideration has to be given to accepting and adopting Indigenous perspective, beliefs, and values. And if someone like me says that, people, when people think about their ancestry, they think about Europe and they think about these other places. And a lot of times, those links, those lineages are pretty weak. They may not have maintained contact with their original homelands, and so there's kind of a dead end for people there. But I would propose to look closer and to look further back, because even within Europeans' beginnings, there were tribal ways. Irish people had tribal ways. German people had tribal ways. Before the Romans showed up, and before Constantine showed up and left from being a pagan and decided to become a Christian person, that there was tribal ways. So every time that Rome invaded a different territory, much of the conflict was with people who still had spiritual beliefs in the land. And I would say that some of that, hello? I would say that some of that has continued even in the early colonial days of Virginia, that Black people, Irish people, Indians, they had families together. They shared a diverse society, and for a short period in that time, that there was a lot of solidarity between people, and the corporate interests got really fearful of that. It doesn't mean that that there was no economy. Actually, it was the people that were working the economy that had made the economy successful. But the plantation owners did not like the idea that there was a solidarity that was developing, and it was developing in a very natural way. Years in that same period of time, there was wampum belt history taking place, and within those forums, they were pretty much always, those wampum belts were something to do with the land, and people participated. Europeans, Englishmen, other people participated and behaved and had expectations to when they participated in those forums. It was only when they found out they could not manipulate those systems to do their own bidding to say this land now officially belongs to us. To say no, it's an arrangement around the land. It doesn't have to belong to either one of us. We just have to agree on how we're going to make this work. So that's one limit. I think at a real more fundamental level, when I talk about limits, I'll say it this way, that you got science right now saying there's a lot of trouble headed our way because of what we're doing to the environment. You got one body of knowledge that's saying this. You've got another body of knowledge coming from Indigenous people saying these are the new views, these are the kinds of values, these are the other types of things that have to start to be taken more seriously, being adopted. You've got two bodies of knowledge coming to the same conversation point. And, way back in Europe, when I was talking about that just a minute ago, the idea was to ask permission to go out on the land, have that spiritual relationship. And a big part of that was asking permission. And I would say that without humans feeling they don't have to ask permission, that's the problem. Because without not asking for permission, then there are no limits. There's no limits for anything. You feel that you're just become this person, this the human that just feels that there's no value on anything, and everything's up for grabs. And I think it's that simple recognition of needing to ask for permission to be able to do something. And that's when I think that's at the more deeper end of asking, talking about limits, is that we've got to start to, and if we can't get there, then really all we're doing is we're adopting a mentality that's taking away the future of children. We're boring out of their future. We're limiting even more than what they are going to have in the end to work with. And I kind of think that's either one of those things to talk about limits is probably going to be a good thing. I'm thinking that in an odd way, I've also asked the first question for Curtis to say this is some of the convincing. This is the challenge, to lower our expectations. I mean, if anything, out of the COVID pandemic, it really made us stay in our own company and to maybe look at more simpler things to do with ourselves instead of looking for the most action-filled
30
movie.
seconds.
Okay, I'll end it there.
Okay. Thank you, Eric. Okay, Barry, 5 minutes.
Thanks very much for those questions. Well, one was about economy at the expense of the environment, and the other was about the limits to growth. At least that's my understanding of the of the questions. So, as we say in the labor movement, with respect to environmentalism, it's not a luxury, it's a necessity, because there are no jobs under 10 meters of water. We continue to pollute and to fill the atmosphere with carbon waste, which traps the rays of the sun and melts the polar ice caps, raising seawater levels. I mean, killing marine life, by the million, but also dooming all the coastal cities to destruction, and wreaking havoc with weather patterns around the globe. There are no jobs under 10 meters of water is a statement that symbolizes the havoc that results from human activity that is uncontrolled. While it's controlled in the interests of private profit, but it's not controlled in the interests of the vast majority. So there is no economy without respect for the environment. It's not a matter of, subordinating the economy to supernatural sense of what the environment might wish for itself. It's a matter of permitting the future of the economy by ensuring that we have a world that can sustain human life and the life of all the other animals and plants that survive on this planet, have done so hitherto. So another example of the foolish suggestion that the economy has to trump the interests of workers' rights is evident in the current COVID-19 pandemic, where frontline workers are forced to work under intolerable conditions, exposed to the virus, not even afforded sick leave, paid sick leave, so that they can, so that we can, as a society, reduce the multiplication of the disease across the population with which the frontline workers come into contact daily. So the shame, the scandal of it all, it stems from deforestation, which brings different alien species into contact with one another, sharing diseases, spreading them, all the way to the lack of control with respect to implementation of necessary health measures, protection of those, particularly in long-term care, where 80% of the deaths occurred in relation to COVID-19. It's an absolute scandal, and companies make profit and deliver millions of dollars in profit to shareholders, while they crowd seniors into abysmal conditions and seal their fate. Limits to growth. Well, there are objectively limits to growth. The question is, who will decide how we should grow and for what purpose a growth should occur? Growth in the interest of the majority is a very different proposition than the growth that is subordinate to the maximization of private profit. So the question of limits to growth is really a question of democracy, economic democracy. It's not just a matter of the unsavory aspects of consumerism. It's about making decisions about a whole range of things. I mean, there is the over-packaging of products, which people have been protesting for decades. That one way to limit waste would be to limit that. There's the planned obsolescence, which is inherent in the business cycle of the capitalist economy.
30 seconds.
We need to produce things that will last, and not produce things that are bound to fall apart just so that a company can produce another generation of pretty much the same thing that's destined to fall apart in short order, so as to bolster their profit, their bottom line. Carbon-based energy. Yes, there's a limit to the spread of carbon waste into the atmosphere. We probably come as close to exceeding that limit as we dare. And then there's the enormous waste on the military. Weapons of mass destruction and weapons of destruction of all kinds.
Wrap up, Barry.
That has to be seen as a feature of the limits that we want to enact, and that can only be done through economic democracy, and that requires a working class revolution to take the power away from those who are polluting, plundering, and wasting the resources of the world. Thanks.
Thank you, Barry. Okay, so we're going to go to the Kurt for the next two questions. Kurt?
Okay. Among the indigenous population, among the indigenous populations, examples First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, social conditions have been impacted by the dispossession of cultural traditions, social inequities, prejudice, and discrimination. Can you talk about the differences or similarities? And our final question. We have seen many acts of solidarity with Indigenous communities across North America in the past 2 years, like Standing Rock, but many have not lasted the test of time. How can we maintain these acts of solidarity after all the cameras go away?
Okay, go ahead, Barry, and then Eric.
Okay, well, I'm just
Well,
jotting
you have 5 minutes.
right. There was a question about cultural traditions, prejudice, and discrimination. Can you talk about the differences or similarities? I'm not sure I really understand the question.
I think they mean between the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. The discrimination against these peoples.
Within the indigenous population?
Yes.
Well, to the extent that this is true, and I don't know, I'm not indigenous, I'm not living in those communities. I think Eric will have more to say about that. But we know the divide and rule tactic is one that is employed by the corporate elite and their state, where they can foster negative attitudes towards some, and temporarily promote others who are willing to play the game of corporate power over resources. They will do that, and that's not unusual. It's been a practice of the imperialists, the corporate elite, in terms of driving populations in the Arab world against one another. I mean, the Arab world stretches from Northwest Africa right through to beyond the Persian Gulf, and it's basically a common language with important distinctions locally, but instead of one nation standing up to imperialism, we have competing elites that have been fostered by the colonizers, by the foreign interests, chiefly Western interests, who have intervened and who have profited by turning one group against the other. So why should it be any different in Turtle Island? That is the strategy. Dispossession of cultural traditions is a serious problem, and as Indigenous people come to the forefront in reclaiming their rights, their land, their languages, in fact we see a resurgence of revitalization of language and culture to save what remains of the proud First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. And that is a result of social movements which have challenged corporate control, corporate waste, corporate destruction of the environment. So there's a mutual benefit that derives from building mass social movements. And it's important for socialists to argue for this in the mainstream workers movement, that we take up these issues not as an act of charity, but as an act of solidarity, recognizing that only when the working class unites against the common foe can we change the system, get rid of the life-destroying profit system. As Karl Marx famously said over 150 years ago to the workers in England, one nation that oppresses another will never be free. So it was incumbent on the English workers to take up the cause of Irish freedom so that they themselves could be free. and forge a unity that's necessary. That's why it's important for males in the workers' movement to take up the cause of women's equality, to take up the cause of LGBTQI equality, because that's how you forge real unity. There are some on the left who say, well, these are, these are selfish, self-interested groups, identity politics, they call it. But that's a completely mistaken, tragically misapplied approach to the issue. People are fighting their oppression. They stand up for their oppression, and when they see the hand of solidarity is extended to them, they in turn can envision the possibility not only of overcoming the discrimination they suffer, but overcoming the nature of a society which is controlled by 1%. That is the fountain of discrimination and oppression and toxic practices in relation to the earth, the sky, the air, the soil. So that's the perspective that we need. There's a reason why Indigenous cultural identities have been suppressed, and it has a lot to It has a lot to do with the clash between modes of production that I spoke of at the beginning of this of my presentation. The clash between the system of common ownership of tools and resources, a communistic system of the Indigenous people before contact, which flourished, and the private property violence, slave-bearing European settlers. Prime example is the potlatch ceremony, which many Indigenous nations on the West Coast practiced. And what was the potlatch all about? It was when there was a surplus in the community, share it. And in fact, if the surplus was even beyond the ability to share it, destroy it. No one should accumulate power or wealth over others. Live communally, recognize the needs of the population, and decide democratically how to dispose of the common wealth. That is a model. The potlatch was made illegal by the federal government. Indigenous people were persecuted for practicing the potlatch ceremony, and that is a shameful element in Canadian history that needs to be not just apologized but reversed. We need to have a continental potlatch where we meet the needs of everybody, where we make decisions collectively in a democratic way, and we advance as a society. And that's the path that we propose.
Okay, thank you. Eric, you have 5 minutes.
Okay. I didn't fully answer the last question with dinner with Franklin, and I think that some of these other questions are pretty much landing in the same area. The idea that there was discourse even within our own communities in terms of which direction do we go? How do we achieve a path into the future? You could talk about the first person to learn the English language on our reserve and how much authority that gave that person, as opposed to who was really the recognized traditional leader because he knew the culture, the language, and history, and all the rest of it. So that division was, but in terms of the conversation where we've all experienced dispossession of our culture. We've all experienced dispossession of our lands. We've also experienced all forms of prejudice and discrimination. But again, kind of going back to the Mike Harris days, and there was only really a handful of communities that invested in a natural resource-based self-government, not the administrative relationship offered by the Indian Act. That is a whole different type of relationship. The Indigenous relationship would be the people that continue to believe in the clan systems, that continue to believe in the nation-to-nation relationship established through treaty by wampum belts. These would be the people who would push for natural resource-based self-government. And again, there was only a handful. Mike Harris was more than aware of what handful he was talking about. The communities up around Sault Ste. Marie, the Six Nations people, the Wapo Island people, the Kettle Point people, the people within the Saugeen territory. There was the Tanganyika people. There was only a real handful that were preparing for those types of challenges. And so they invested in the history. They invested in creating management plan. They invested in preparing themselves to make the challenges around natural environments and natural resources. And Mike Harris put $20 million and some dollars apart off to the side because he knew he had to take these people out. He had to take these people out because he knew that all the other not public rights were already being eroded, and he needed to get those indigenous rights out of the land so that the industries could come in and do what they wanted. They would make those investments in those areas. So the now that reconciliation is on the rise, or has been on the rise, that you're starting to get a different. There's people who are standing on the footings that they created in the last 20 years. For those that didn't really create any footings within natural resource type of presence, to create a presence for their larger personality that is beyond the Indian Act. Those are the differences. Those end up being really major differences. I think that there's a way to increase the solidarity and see this some of the vision that's trying to emerge is, how do you use treaty rights to help to be a form of government that looks after everybody in the treaty area, not only just Native people, but non-Native people as well. And that is that talks about an arrangement. That talks about, and again, the same arrangement that was made about treaties, the same arrangement that was made about wampum belts. I think those really are people type forums, and to kind of go back to these other type of arrangements. There's no way that the Native personality can move forward and leave behind the treaties and leave behind these other things, leave behind their culture, leave behind these other things that create their personality. Some of the differences is that the idea of culture, the idea of a spiritual culture, it's not just window dressing. It doesn't. You just can't pick it up and then enter into conversations. It's the other way around. It's actually the culture that produces those political people. It's not a political person who can come by and then pick up certain aspects of the culture and say, well, I'm this. No, it's the other way around. It's that the cultural beliefs, the cultural worldview is something you've lived your entire life beside. And because you've done that, then that is the worldview. That is your political worldview too, that you're operating from. And so those are the I guess what I'm talking about. Those, if there are differences, those are where those differences are being made. Is that they're the types of commitments, where fishing rights are just not fishing rights. Actually, fishing rights have involve at some point in the Indigenous personality, it involves a spiritual commitment to the whitefish, because the whitefish is one of the clan systems. And when those whitefish are represented as something other than a resource, that's the difference. That's the you just can't do what you want to the whitefish, and you have to behave a certain way. Certain expectations are there. And if you got a person that's had really nothing to do with any of that all their lives, they may find themselves on a reserve. But again, that is that whole push of assimilation. That's that whole Indian system that was meant to strip us of our personality. Because without that deeper spiritual foundation, we become just like everybody else, and that's the danger. Is that the whole plan was to wipe us out culturally, linguistically. So we had no memory and history of our past.
30 seconds.
And that was the bigger game. And then as Banks said it the best, when it's in a Sundance ceremony with him, you almost had us. They almost had us. But there was some that said no. There was some that were going to struggle. There was some that were going to go, no, we're not going to give up on who we are. And, way back then, those few words made the difference. And it set in motion a whole other turning, a whole other generation of people. Put everybody on a different path.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Okay, so that is the end of our questions, but we'll go back to our panelists for a 3-minute wrap up. So, Eric, if you would have some more words you'd like to say to us, you can do so now. 3 minutes.
Running out of steam.
Well,
I would say that although I work for the Native Center, and the Native Centers, it's not really it's not a political forum. It's more of a people's forum. It's a service forum. I think that the people that you are going to find there, though, are deeply committed to life or language preservation, cultural preservation, drumming, singing, all those things that end up making the political person. And although my role here today is to really talk about a political worldview, I think that there's more to it than that. There's a whole other logic, and there's all these other forms of history and ceremony and other things. Those help form that logic. And I think that the idea is to further the idea too that it's not reconciliation is not trying to meet. To me, is not trying to meet the Indigenous people halfway. It's more about identifying the common ground that we all stand on. It's that's a politician that's talking. Well, I have to meet you. No. Let's talk about what's important to us. Let's talk about water. Let's talk about land. Let's talk about children. Let's talk about these things that we have in common. And let's once we identify the types of values, then truth, compassion, honesty, all those other things start to be part of those conversations as well. Anyways, that's my 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Barry, 3 minutes.
Well, I like where Eric was going with that, those latter remarks. We need a wider definition of politics. Politics is not just about parties whose leaders strive for the spoils of government office. Politics is about control over the issues of everyday life, the issues that affect people, where they live, where they work, where they breathe, where they want to express themselves. Politics is about our lack of control as the majority of humanity over the means of production, distribution, and exchange. It is our lack of control over the disposal of the wealth of society created by nature and by human labor, and to ensure through the disposal of life and resources so that everyone has good housing, good education, good food, and a good future. And that we can use science to expand our possibilities without exhausting the limited resources of the world. Someone asked a question about Standing Rock, and it said that it was an important moment, but it wasn't sustainable. Well, I want to talk about that for a minute. At Standing Rock, Indigenous and white farmers stood together against the XL pipeline corporations. But, you know, even though they had a huge encampment and they did many amazing things and communicated with the outside world, they were confronted and scattered by the local police, the FBI, National Guard, etc. So this is something we saw at Oka. This is something we saw on Wet'suwet'en territory when the RCMP, heavily armed, invaded and abused people on their own unceded land. How are we going to overcome the state power? Is it possible? Yes, it is. And all of the existing states in the world today did not exist 200 or 300 years ago. Some of them didn't exist even just decades ago. So the world is in a constant state of change. And we are the agents of change if we understand our capacity to unite around demands that are felt deeply and desired by people. We can overcome state power. Can we overcome it? Can we overcome unjust state decisions through a legal challenge? Well, I don't want to say never wage a legal challenge. I've had to engage in some court activism myself, but it's not sufficient. It is far from sufficient because the rulers have written the laws to benefit them. Can a management plan for the environment do the trick? Capitalism is not going to be persuaded unless it adds to the bottom line. There's a fundamental contradiction between the interests of the private property owners and accumulators of fabulous wealth and the state that they employ to defend that wealth against the rest of the population, and the interests of the population, particularly the working class, which has the power not only to make things, but also to bring society to a halt and then to restart it on a new basis. So that is what it's going to take. How to build a mass social movement beyond the territory of Standing Rock was the question that faced those activists, and they weren't able to resolve it by themselves. So we have to understand how we can contribute to a solution. We need to take the cause, all the just causes that arise, into the unions, into the social justice movement, into anti-war coalitions. We have to team up with environmentalists and feminists, all the people who have a grievance, a just grievance against the system, the way things are. Now, there are certain pitfalls to avoid. In the United
30
States,
seconds.
in the United States, it's important not to go into the Democratic Party, where social movements die, but to build a mass labor party. In Canada, to fight for workers and Indigenous agenda in the NDP and the unions, but don't settle for the banal electoralism and careerism of the NDP leaders. The apex of this strategy, I'll close on this point, the apex of our strategy as Socialist Action, Ligue pour l'Action Socialiste, across the Canadian state and our sister organization in the US, Socialist Action, the apex of our strategy is the construction of a revolutionary party that unites all the strivings for liberation, in which we want to invite Indigenous people to join with us and to build a party, not to give up your autonomous organizations. No, continue to fight, regain your language, your traditions, but also unite with those who want to smash capitalism, replace it with workers' power, and to institute a workers' agenda in harmony with nature. That is the indispensable element for victory over capitalism and its state. We fight 365 days of the year for this objective. If you agree, join us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barry. So special thanks to Eric and of course to Barry and to Kurt, our producer in Mississauga. Please consider being a supporter of Socialist Action newspaper, which we will send to you online. To fill out the form, just visit our website at www.socialistaction.ca. And if you would like to talk to us about joining SA, write to socialistactioncanada@gmail.com or just call 647-986-1917. And once again, folks, if you like this show, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. The next essay webcast will be on Thursday, April the 8th, 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and it's titled Socialism and Religion, with gay rights pioneer John Wilson, plus Alex Badella in Toronto, Emily Steers in Guelph, and Ellen Smith in Vancouver. So in the meantime, please be safe, stay healthy, stay active,